April 18th, 1943. 9,000 feet above the green spine of Bougainville, Solomon Islands. The air is thin and sharp, cold enough to sting through cloth and leather, yet the cockpit of the American fighter vibrates with heat and effort. A Lockheed P-38 Lightning claws east with both engines pulling, twin booms shuddering as the pilot keeps the nose steady on a heading that should feel impossible. Far below, the jungle looks endless, a wrinkled carpet of wet leaves and shadow. There is no friendly coastline in sight, no comforting radio chatter, only the steady numbers in the mind, the fuel gauges, the compass, and the awareness that this far from home. A single mistake becomes the ocean. Ahead, a smudge grows into shapes. 2 Mitsubishi G4M bombers, the Japanese call them Betty, flying low and confident, with a small escort of Zeros. They are where they are not supposed to be, at precisely the time they were not supposed to be. The P-38's Titan formation, drop tanks already gone, bellies lighter, hearts heavier. In one cockpit, a pilot wets his lips and presses his mouth closer to the oxygen mask. You can almost feel his hands, slick inside gloves, tightening on the yoke. The Americans do not climb. They do not circle. They slide in like knives. The first burst of .50 caliber fire rips through the air, white streaks in the sun. The Betty jolts as if struck by a giant fist. Metal peels, glass flashes, a wing root spits smoke. The bomber tries to keep level. Stubborn, doomed. Another P-38 angles in, and the 20mm cannon thuds, each impact a punch that leaves jagged holes. For a moment, the Japanese escort reacts, Zeros rolling in a clean, practiced snap. But the geometry is wrong. The enemy has arrived from too far away, on too precise a line. With too much speed, the bomber begins to burn. Inside that burning aircraft is Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the architect of Japan's early thunder. Now, in a few seconds of violence and flame, the symbol of Japanese naval power is falling out of the sky into jungle that does not care about rank or legacy. Far away at Rabaul, on the island of New Britain, the day is humid and loud with insects. The headquarters buildings sit under coconut palms and camouflage netting, with trenches cut into red earth. Couriers move between maps and radios. The men here have lived for months under the rhythm of air alarms, the distant drone, the sudden siren, the thump of anti-aircraft guns, the tense pause afterward when everyone counts losses. When the message arrives, it moves faster than gossip. A staff officer, sweat darkening his collar, enters a room where a Japanese army general bends over a map table. The general is Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, commander of the 8th Area Army. Around him, other officers stand stiffly, faces controlled, eyes alert. A naval liaison officer is present as well, his cap set carefully, his posture too rigid to hide what he already knows. The staff officer speaks, clipped and formal. A name, a location, a confirmation. Imamura's hand stops moving. A pencil rests on the map like a frozen needle. For a heartbeat, the room holds its breath. Yamamoto is dead, not lost to a random patrol. Not ambushed near a carrier battle. Shot down on a carefully timed flight. Far from the front-line chaos. As if the Americans could reach through the clouds and choose who lives. The naval officer's jaw tightens. "Enemy fighters," he says, and then repeats it more quietly, as if repeating it makes it less unbelievable. At that distance, Imamura looks at the map, then up at the ceiling, as if he can see through the roof to the blue sky above Rabaul. He has spent his career calculating logistics, marches, artillery ranges, the pace of men on muddy roads. But this is different. This is the war arriving from beyond the horizon. The outside, on the airfields and revetments around Rabaul. The Japanese already feel it. Mechanics working on Zero fighters keep one ear tuned for engines that are not theirs. Soldiers digging new foxholes do not talk about tanks. They talk about the sound of a bomber formation approaching, like distant surf that keeps getting louder until it becomes a wall. Imamura's staff begins to argue in careful tones. Some insist it must have been luck. Some blame carelessness. But the hard truth sits in the center of the table like a weight. The Americans have long legs now. Long-range fighters. Better navigation. Better coordination. And somewhere in the American system, a set of eyes that sees further than Japanese doctrine ever planned for. Imamura gives orders anyway, because generals always do. Disperse aircraft. Improve camouflage. Tighten the perimeter. Move key meetings underground when possible. But as he speaks, he watches faces and reads what they willn't say aloud. If the Americans can pick off the most protected man in the Pacific sky, what can they do to a supply convoy on a moonless night? What can they do to an isolated battalion on a coastal track? What can they do to an airfield that depends on a single fuel dump and a few tired anti-aircraft guns? The fear is not panic. It is something colder. It is the realization that from 1943 onward, the sky will no longer be a place Japan controls or even contests evenly. The sky will become an American weapon, and every Japanese plan on land will have to live under it, or die under it. November 5th, 1943. Simpson Harbor. Rabaul. Late morning. The sky over the harbor looks clean at first. A hard tropical blue that makes men squint. Then the warning comes. Not from a lookout shouting at a glint on the horizon, but from a radio message that arrives already shaped into certainty. American carriers are out there, somewhere beyond the curve of the sea. Their decks have turned into assembly lines of wings and gasoline. On the ridges above the harbor, Japanese army sentries stand near fresh-dug pits, rifles slung, faces turned upward. They have learned to listen for the first note of engines like farmers listen for thunder. In the town below, sailors and laborers freeze in the street. Anti-aircraft crews sprint to their guns, boots slapping boards and coral. A siren rises and wavers, then steadies into a continuous howl. The first American aircraft appear as dots, then as a line, then as a swarm. Grumman TBF Avengers and Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers push downward, and around them a guard of fighters drops like hawks. Some are the stub-nosed wildcats the Japanese have fought before, but now there are more and faster shapes too, thick-winged and confident. F6F, hellcats that do not turn as prettily as a Zero, but do not need to. They climb better, dive harder, and they keep coming back for another pass. At a command post dug into the red earth, Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura hears the harbor erupt. The air shakes with the flat crack of medium-caliber guns and the deeper thump of heavy pieces. The ground trembles as bombs hit the water and throw up pillars of spray that collapse into rain. He steps outside and watches the harbor through binoculars. He sees ships twisting at anchor, making smoke, crews fighting fires already burning, and he sees something else that turns his stomach. The American fighters do not seem to search. They already know where to be. A Zero flight rises to meet them, pale green bellies flashing, pilots climbing with desperate discipline. The Zeros try to gain height over the attackers, but the Americans arrive with speed and altitude to spare. Hellcats roll in, guns flashing, and the sky becomes a series of short, brutal calculations. A Zero tries to turn inside. The Hellcat does not follow the turn. It climbs, stalls the Zero's angle, then drops a burst that hits the Japanese fighter like a hammer. Down near the waterfront, Japanese soldiers press themselves against walls and sandbags, hands over helmets. The sound of a strafing run is different from bombing. Bombing is distant violence that suddenly becomes nearby. Strafing is intimate. You hear the engine, you feel the air rip, and then the bullets chew the ground in a straight line that walks toward you as if guided by a finger. The raid lasts minutes, but when it ends, it leaves behind hours of smoke and shouting. Imamura returns to the map table, and the reports come in with a steady brutality. Aircraft losses. Fuel tanks hit, communications cut, a warehouse burning, a battery silenced. A naval officer points at the paper and says what everyone is thinking, but no one wants to frame as doctrine. The Americans are coordinating their strikes with a precision Japan cannot match anymore. Their fighters are escorting deeper. Their formations are thicker. Their pilots are arriving trained, not merely brave. And behind them is an invisible machine of detection and direction that keeps improving. Radar. It is a word that spreads through Japanese staff rooms like a sickness. Many officers have heard of it before, but now they feel it. The Americans are not guessing where you are. They are finding you. A destroyer can pick up incoming aircraft beyond visual range. A shore station can see a raid forming over the sea. A fighter director can put interceptors exactly where they need to be, without wasting fuel climbing and searching. In 1942, Japanese commanders could still believe in surprise. They could still believe night, weather, distance, and silence were allies. In 1943, those allies begin to desert them. On Bougainville, only a few weeks later, an infantry battalion moves along a coastal track under dripping jungle canopy. The men are thin, uniforms stained dark with sweat, boots rotting. They carry rifles, light machine guns, a mortar tube wrapped in cloth. Their captain tells them to stay under the trees, to avoid open beaches. But the fear is no longer only of American patrols. It is the sky. You can be marching in single file, trying to keep your breath quiet, and suddenly the jungle brightens with a passing shadow. The men flatten instinctively, faces in mud because they know what comes next. A P-38 or a Navy fighter appears low, searching along the coastline like a predator scanning for movement. If it sees you, it will return. If it returns, it will bring friends. The Americans have aircraft that can range out and back. Long legs that make the ocean feel smaller. They have bombers that visit again and again. Heavy, steady, patient, and each time the Japanese try to move supplies by barge at night, the sea is no longer safe darkness. Flares bloom over the water, turning waves into white glass. Then bombs and rockets hammer the barges until the coastline burns. A Japanese major writes a message for his superior, hands shaking as he tries to keep the characters neat. Ammunition low, food nearly gone, medical supplies exhausted, men dying of fever and wounds. He pauses, listening for engines. In his mind, every plan ends the same way: move and be seen, stay and be starved. Back at Rabaul, Imamura understands what his field officers cannot yet put into one sentence. When American air power becomes constant, Japanese ground power becomes isolated. Once isolated, it becomes predictable. Once predictable, it becomes targetable. That is why the generals begin to fear, not because the Americans bomb harder, but because they bomb with a system, because the system makes distance irrelevant, darkness temporary, concealment fragile, because it turns every jungle track and every supply dump into a question the sky can answer. February 17th, 1944. Truck Lagoon, Caroline Islands. Dawn. The first sound is not the bombs. It is the engines. A distant, layered growl that thickens until it seems to press on the skin. In the anchorage, Japanese sailors look up from decks slick with night dew. Smoke from galley fires hangs low and still, for a heartbeat. Truck feels like what Tokyo once promised it would be: an unbreakable fortress of ships, fuel, aircraft, and shore guns hidden behind reefs. Then the sky fractures. American carrier aircraft pour in above the lagoon, diving out of the early sun so fast the eye struggles to follow. Hellcats rake the airfields at low altitude. machine gun fire stitching through revetments and tents. Dive bombers angle down in clean lines, releasing bombs that fall without mercy into clustered cargo ships. Explosions slap across the water, throwing up columns of spray and shattered steel. A tanker blooms into orange flame, the heat visible even from the shoreline. Men run, stumble, vanish into smoke. A Japanese army officer attached to the base, a major with a map case slung over his shoulder, crouches behind a seawall as fragments pepper the stones. He watches a transport ship list hard, men spilling into the water. He hears the shriek of bombs and the deep churn of anti-aircraft guns firing until barrels glow. He is trained to think in supply tonnage and marching speeds. Now, he is watching supply turn into fire. In a bunker nearby, the base commanders fight their radios. Messages are shouted, repeated, garbled. Requests for fighter cover. Reports of fuel dumps burning, a desperate list of what is already lost. Yet the Americans keep arriving at the right angles, at the right height, as if someone is placing them on the sky like pieces on a board. When the major runs across open ground, you feel the exposure with him. The world narrows to the hiss of bullets and the certainty that the aircraft above can see movement, can choose it, can erase it. A fighter sweeps low. The major throws himself into a crater, face against coral gravel. The plane passes, then it turns and comes back because it has time, fuel, and control. By midday, Truck is no longer a fortress. It is a demonstration. The Japanese army major survives the first day, and when night falls, he expects relief in darkness. Instead, flares drift down over the lagoon, slow and bright, turning the water into a pale mirror. Fires on ships light the clouds from below. Even in the dark, the Americans continue to strike. It is not constant, but it is enough. Enough to keep men awake, enough to keep engines off, enough to keep barges from running, enough to make every commander understand that the old refuge of night is no longer reliable. Weeks later, that understanding travels west with every courier and every survivor. June 15th, 1944. Saipan, Marianas Islands. Before sunrise, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito sits in a command cave cut into limestone, air heavy with damp. A lantern flickers on rough walls. Outside, the sea is a faint roar, then a growing thunder as American naval guns begin to fire. The bombardment builds in layers. First, a distant rumble, then sharp cracking impacts that make dust fall from the ceiling, then a sustained pounding that turns the island into a shaking drum. Saito's staff hunches over maps, listening to telephone lines that sputter and die. A young captain tries to keep his voice steady while reporting unit positions. Another officer holds a receiver to his ear and hears only static. The ground telephone system, so carefully laid, is already being severed by shells and collapsing trenches. Above ground, runners are useless because the open is death. Then the aircraft arrive. Carrier planes sweep over Saipan in waves, engine noise blending with artillery until it becomes one continuous assault. American fighters descend low across the island, strafing ridgelines, vehicles, any movement. Bombers hit suspected gun positions. A hit is followed by another, and another. As if the pilots can see through jungle and rock, Saito steps out for a moment to breathe fresher air and is immediately struck by the rhythm of it. The Americans have arranged the day. Naval gunfire pounds the coast. Aircraft roam and slash the interior. Spotters adjust fire. Radios coordinate. It is not merely power. It is coverage. A Japanese colonel arrives with dust on his face and blood on his sleeve. He reports that a battalion attempting to reposition was caught in the open by fighters and cut apart. Not by a single dramatic attack, but by repeated passes. Men pinned, officers unable to signal, the wounded unable to be moved. The survivors forced back into cover where they can do nothing but wait. Saito looks at his island like a map of shrinking options. Japanese doctrine values decisive battle, concentration at the right point. But concentration is now a beacon. Every time troops mass, the sky notices. Every time a gun fires, the sky traces the flash. Every time a truck moves, the sky follows the dust. Even the sea has changed. At night, small boats try to slip between islands. They used to trust darkness and silence. Now American destroyers prowl with radar sets that see beyond the horizon line of the eye. A wake on the water becomes a target. A radio transmission becomes a clue. A supply run that once felt daring now feels suicidal. Inside the cave, Saito's officers begin to speak of fighting from holes and tunnels, of dispersal, of endurance. Not because they want to, but because they have learned the new truth. In 1944, the Americans do not need to defeat a Japanese army in a clean field battle. They can isolate it, starve it, keep its head down, grind it apart from above until the ground fight becomes a final act. Saito writes an order with steady strokes, but he cannot write the unspoken line beneath it: the sky belongs to the enemy. October 24th, 1944, Leyte Gulf, Philippines, late afternoon. A Japanese Army liaison officer stands on a hillside above Tacloban, sweat running down his neck, binoculars pressed to his eyes. The air smells of crushed grass and cordite. Offshore, the sea is busy with smoke and movement, ships turning, gun flashes winking like lightning in the daylight. The ground under his boots vibrates with distant naval gunfire. Somewhere below, Japanese troops dig in along roads and palm groves, trying to organize a defense that feels already late. The liaison officer hears aircraft before he sees them. It is a rolling sound, not the high thin whine of a few fighters, but the heavy layered roar of a sky crowded with engines. He lifts his binoculars. American planes, not a handful, but a canopy. Fighters, bombers, dive bombers, and something else. Escort patterns that stretch far across the horizon. For the Japanese soldier on the ground, the effect is immediate. The sky is no longer empty space between battles. It is a ceiling of danger. On Leyte's roads, a Japanese truck column tries to move under trees. The drivers keep headlights off, even in dusk, and they stop often. Listening. The men ride silent. Rifles across laps, mouths dry. Their orders are simple. Reach the front. Deliver ammunition, bring back wounded. But every mile is a gamble. A single American fighter appears low, turning along the line of the road, scanning for the straight edges and unnatural motion that betray vehicles. It is an F-6F Hellcat, thick-bodied, steady, flying like it owns the air. It passes once, banking. The column freezes. Engines cut. Men holding breath. The fighter turns again. It comes back with a second aircraft. Then a third. In seconds, rockets slam into the lead truck, turning it into a furnace. The second truck swerves, hits a ditch, flips. Men spill into mud. Then the strafing begins. Bullets chopping leaves, tearing canvas, punching bodies. The column dissolves into scattered survivors, crawling into the undergrowth. An officer with a sword tries to rally them, shouting until his voice cracks, but his words cannot reach above the engines. He points men toward a clearing to set up a machine gun. The moment they do, the fighters return and rake the clearing into silence. Farther inland, Japanese artillery attempts to fire on the American beachhead. The guns are well placed, camouflaged, crews trained to load fast. They fire a few rounds. The shell bursts near the coast. For a heartbeat, it feels like resistance. Then the American response is immediate. Aircraft appear overhead and circle like hawks. A spotter has seen the muzzle flash. A radio call is made. A fighter drops low and marks the area with strafing. Then a bomber follows, dropping a bomb that lands close enough to flip the gun and shred the crew. The survivors scramble, dragging wounded, trying to pull the weapon into cover, but the next strike comes before they can move it. The system is relentless. In Tokyo, generals and staff officers look at the reports and see the same pattern repeating across the Pacific. Their ground forces are not losing because they are cowardly. They are losing because the Americans have taken away movement. Movement is life in war. Movement is supply, reinforcement, evacuation, surprise. Without movement, a unit becomes a fixed point on a map, and fixed points can be erased. The American long-range fighters are a key part of that trap. By 1943 and into 1944, American aircraft do not merely defend bombers or patrol nearby. They range out, escort, hunt, and linger. They stay overhead long enough to catch the second attempt, the third attempt, the moment when exhausted men finally risk the road again. At an American forward airstrip, pierced steel planking laid over mud, pilots climb into fighters with a practiced rhythm. Ground crewmen slap the fuselage, point at fuel caps, shout last-minute warnings. The fighters take off in pairs, then fours. Wheels tucking up, climbing into a sky that feels safe to them and lethal to everyone else. The pilots have maps, compasses, and now increasingly reliable radios. They can call for support. They can coordinate with ships. They can work with observers on the ground. They are not lone duelists anymore. They are part of a network, and the Japanese notice the network most of all. A Japanese army captain on Leyte tries to lead his platoon through a coconut grove to counterattack. He keeps them spread out, 5 meters apart, then 10. He knows clustering draws bombs. They move in short bursts, freezing whenever engines approach, even when no aircraft are visible. The fear of being seen dictates the pace. When they reach a ridge, the captain looks through the leaves and sees the American positions ahead. He wants to charge. He wants to do what he was trained to do, to close with the enemy and decide the fight with bayonets and grenades. But above, the sound returns. A formation of American fighters appears, and with them a pair of bombers. They do not attack immediately. They circle, searching. The captain realizes the terrible thing. The Americans can afford to wait. They can keep aircraft aloft. They can patrol an area until the Japanese must move, must reveal themselves, must try to do something. When the captain finally orders the attack, the men surge forward, shouting, because shouting is the only way to push through terror. The fighters drop in and shred the ridgeline with gunfire. A bomb hits nearby and throws soil and bodies into the air. The attack collapses, not because the men refuse to fight, but because the sky has already broken their timing, their cohesion, their chance. By the time night comes, the Japanese are still not safe. American radar-guided ships and aircraft keep probing, catching barges, catching movements, catching the desperate attempts to shift wounded or bring up ammunition. Darkness becomes a thinner curtain. For Japanese generals, this is the new nightmare after 1943. Not one decisive weapon, but a combination radar that sees fighters that reach, bombers that return, coordination that turns every mistake into destruction. February 19th, 1945, Iwo Jima, 0645. The black sand still cold from night. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi stands deep inside a concrete and volcanic rock bunker, the air tasting of sulfur and damp. A telephone sits on a crate beside him, its lines snaking through tunnels that twist like veins under the island. Above, you can feel the war before you hear it. The ceiling gives a faint shiver, dust lifting in slow ghosts. Then the naval guns find their rhythm. The first impacts arrive as distant punches. Within seconds, they become a steady hammering that makes the lantern flame tremble. Rock chips fall. Somewhere down the tunnel, a soldier mutters a prayer under his breath and stops himself. Ashamed, Kuribayashi says nothing. He has lived under bombardment long enough to recognize the tone. This is not preparation. This is domination. A runner arrives, face gray with powder, and reports that the outer positions are being erased. Kuribayashi nods once, as if hearing a weather report. He has ordered his men not to waste themselves on the beaches, not to fire wildly at ships they cannot reach. He knows the Americans want a dramatic defense they can crush. He will not give them that. But even here, underground, he cannot escape the truth that every Japanese general has learned since 1943. The Americans own the air, and when the Americans own the air, they also own time. They can choose when the island is pounded. They can choose when the landing craft move. They can choose when the next wave arrives. Outside, the sky over Iwo Jima is busy with aircraft that come and go like a tide. Fighters sweep low, their shadows flicking across ridges. Bombers pass overhead, steady and indifferent, and every few minutes another strike walks across the island. The black sand jumps as if alive. Kuribayashi's staff listens to the roar, and one officer finally voices what hangs in everyone's throat. The Americans are not here only to take Iwo Jima. They are here to build an airfield. An airfield is more than a strip of land. It is a hinge. With it, the American sky reaches further, stays longer, returns faster. From Iwo Jima, the Americans can send fighters to escort bombers all the way to the Japanese home islands. That is what truly terrifies the men who still think in terms of perimeter and fortress. Because once the enemy can escort, the enemy can strike without paying the old price. March 9th, 1945. 2,000 meters above Tokyo. Night. The city is a dark sea of rooftops and narrow streets, with only small lights glowing behind shutters. Then the sirens begin, rising into a wail that moves through districts like a cold wind. Families wake in cramped rooms. Fire wardens grab helmets. Soldiers in the streets look up, searching for silhouettes they cannot see. High above, the first B-29 Superfortresses arrive, and they do not come like raiders. They come like industry. 4 engines each. A slow, relentless drumming that fills the sky. The bombers fly low for their size, heavy with incendiaries. And they have been trained to do this methodically, block by block. In a command post, an army officer watches a wall map under weak light. Reports come in from observers and radar stations, but the picture is broken. Some stations have been destroyed in previous raids. Some are blinded by weather. Some are confused by the sheer number of returns. A telephone rings and rings. A clerk scribbles in pencil until his hand cramps. Fighters are scrambled, but too few. Many pilots are inexperienced now, rushed through training. Fuel is scarce. Engines are worn. The men who once might have climbed into the night with confidence are gone. Their replacements climbing into cockpits with stiff shoulders and dry mouths. And the worst part is what you cannot see from the ground. Above the bomber stream, American fighters patrol, long-range escorts with drop tanks that let them linger. They are there not merely to protect the bombers on the way in, but to punish interceptors on the way up and to hunt anything that tries to follow the bombers back out. The Japanese feel it as a trap closing from both sides. The first incendiaries fall and the city changes in minutes. Tiny fires become lines of fire, then sheets. Wind funnels through streets and turns flame into a living thing. Roof tiles crack, wooden walls flash. People run with bundles in their arms and find alleyways already burning. Firefighting crews drag hoses that suddenly feel useless. The air becomes thick with smoke that tastes of pine, paper, oil, and paint. In a bunker, a Japanese general listens to the reports and understands the new shape of defeat. He's not being beaten by an enemy who must approach his guns. He's being beaten by an enemy who can reach over oceans, arrive at night, and stay long enough to turn a capital into a furnace. After 1943, Japanese ground commanders feared isolation. By 1945, they also fear irrelevance. If cities burn and factories vanish, what does an army on a distant island matter? If airfields are cratered every day, how do reinforcements move? If rail lines are cut from the sky, how do divisions maneuver? Every traditional answer depends on movement, and movement is now watched somewhere on Iwo Jima. Kuribayashi closes his eyes for a moment as another impact shakes the tunnel. He does not have to see Tokyo to know what is coming. He can hear it in the confidence of the American bombardment overhead. The island is being turned into a stepping stone, and beyond it, the homeland is being turned into a target. April 1st, 1945. Okinawa, 0730. The sea off Hagushi. Beaches churning with landing craft. General Mitsuru Ushijima sits in his headquarters carved into the southern hills. Limestone walls sweating with moisture. A candle burns low, its flame tugged by drafts, moving through tunnels. He hears the distant thunder of naval guns like a storm that never passes. On the table in front of him, the map is already marked with red and black pencil lines. Defensive zones, fallback positions, artillery sectors. It is a beautiful plan on paper. Above ground, it is a plan forced to live under a sky that belongs to someone else. Reports arrive in fragments, because wires are cut and runners have to move between shell bursts. Ushijima listens to an officer explain that the Americans are landing in strength, that the beaches are filling with tanks and trucks, that the air above the landing area is crowded with American fighters. Ushijima nods slowly. He expected this. He chose to defend in depth, to bleed the Americans inland, to avoid the kind of coastal slaughter that would only feed the enemy's guns. Yet even his careful strategy cannot change what air superiority does to an army. A Japanese artillery battery hidden in a grove fires a measured salvo, then quickly covers the guns with netting and branches. The crew holds still, trying to vanish. For a few minutes, they believe they have done it properly. Then a fighter passes overhead. Not high and distant, but low enough that the men can see the underside markings. It banks once, twice, as if considering. The pilot has been trained to look for the unnatural a line too straight, a shadow too sharp, a patch of foliage disturbed. The pilot dips a wing and the aircraft circles. Minutes later, bombs fall. Not because the Japanese were careless, but because the Americans have a system that links observation to destruction faster than the Japanese can relocate. The battery tries to run the guns out. Horses strain, men push wheels through mud. A second strike comes before they can clear the grove. The guns flip. The crew dies. The survivors crawl away, leaving the positions to smoke and silence. Ushijima's staff understands the pattern. Any weapon that fires becomes a beacon. Any unit that moves in daylight becomes a target. Any attempt to mass forces for a counterattack becomes an invitation for rockets and bombs. So the Japanese do what they have been forced to do since 1943. They go deeper. They disperse. They hide. But hiding has a price. A division scattered into caves and ravines cannot maneuver quickly. It cannot reinforce a collapsing sector in time. It cannot easily bring ammunition forward. The wounded cannot be evacuated. Orders travel slowly. Morale erodes in the damp darkness. Men living like ghosts while the enemy builds roads and dumps supplies in plain view, protected by fighters overhead. This is the core of the general's fear. American air power does not merely kill men. It breaks the relationship between command and action. A general can draw arrows on a map, but he cannot move those arrows if every road is watched. By summer 1945, the message is no longer confined to frontline commanders. It becomes a national reality. Air raids over Japan multiply. Rail lines are cut. Ports are mined from the air. Factories are hit, then hit again when they try to restart. Even when the Japanese manage to rise in defiance, sending kamikaze aircraft at the American fleet, It is an act of desperation that proves the rule. The Japanese can still strike, but they cannot control. On Okinawa, Ushijima walks through a tunnel lit by weak lamps. He passes soldiers sitting with rifles across their knees, eyes hollow from lack of sleep. He hears the distant rumble of bombs and the closer crack of shells. He stops at a narrow opening that looks out toward the north, toward where the Americans are advancing. In the daylight haze, he can see American aircraft cruising like patrol dogs. They do not hurry. They do not need to. They can wait for a Japanese movement, then crush it. Ushijima remembers earlier years, when Japanese commanders could shift forces at night, could conceal ships behind islands, could believe that a determined counterattack might restore initiative. Now he sees that initiative has changed hands because the sky has become a battlefield Japan cannot win. And that is why Japanese generals feared U.S. air power after 1943. Because it was not only more planes, it was the combination of mass production, pilot training, long-range fighters, radar guidance, and coordinated strike doctrine that turned the Pacific into a place where Japan could not move without being seen. On a jungle island, an isolated battalion learned it first. On fortress bases like Truk and Rabaul, commanders learned it next. On Saipan and Leyte, it became undeniable. On Iwo Jima and Okinawa, it became final. And over Tokyo, it became national. In the end, American air power made the Pacific War a war of isolation. Japanese ground forces could still fight fiercely, still hold caves and ridges, still charge in desperate night attacks. But after 1943, they increasingly fought cut off, short of ammunition, short of food, short of hope, under a sky that could reach them whenever it wished. The lesson that lived in every Japanese headquarters was brutally simple. When the enemy owns the air, the ground becomes a cage.